One.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this conversation about Biden's climate goals and what it means for Massachusetts. We are streaming live from the WBUR City Space YouTube channel, where if you subscribe, you can get a notification every time we go live with an event like this. In tonight's panel, we're going to dig into some details of President Biden's climate agenda and then look at what it means for Massachusetts. We're going to talk about his goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030, his focus on environmental justice, and some specific ideas and plans he's put forward in his $2 trillion infrastructure plan. I am sure you all have tons of questions, and I encourage you to ask them by going to slido.com and typing in the code #climate. Okay, let's get to it. So my first guest tonight needs very little introduction, especially here in Boston, but just in case, Gina McCarthy serves as the White House National Climate Advisor. This means she's tasked with coordinating the entire Biden administration's domestic agenda. Prior to this position, she led the NRDC, taught at the Harvard Public School of Health, and of course, headed up the Environmental Protection Agency under the Obama administration. Advisor McCarthy is also a Boston native and a longtime friend of WBUR. So welcome. We are so happy to have you here with us tonight.
Miriam, it's great to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So my first question is about what President Biden's climate agenda means for Massachusetts. So let's pretend it's 2050 or 2060. What is going to be different about life here in the state?
Well, I think all will go well. So what you're going to see is a utility sector that is clean, that is fully clean. You're going to see lots more electric houses. You're going to see lots more ground source heat pumps. You're going to see lots more renewable energy. You're going to see, hopefully, a much more equitable and just society where communities that have been left behind are finally invested in and get an opportunity to actually make it in the middle class and expand that middle class again. You're going to see actually net zero carbon emissions by 2050. You're going to see, hopefully, a lot cleaner air. And you're going to see a lot more ability to be resilient in the face of changing climate. And if all goes well and not just us achieves these goals, you're going to see basically a world that you'll be proud to hand to your grandchildren at this point if it's 2050. My great-grandchildren, most likely. So I know that sounds like a fantasy, Miriam, but it's well within our reach if we keep pushing. And frankly, we have no choice. We actually have to achieve these levels. But the fun thing is that there's, I think, a tremendous amount of opportunity, like right in front of our noses, that we can take advantage of. And it really doesn't represent sacrifice. It represents opportunity. It represents caring for one another. It represents building, a future that is based on everybody having a fair shot at a good job, even a union job. And it's based on, I think, what we've learned during the pandemic, which is we've got to pay attention to the science. We have to work for and with one another, and we have to invest as if our lives depended on it, because they do.
Great. So clean air, clean water, more electric vehicles. These things all sound fantastic. And one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is that if we're going to meet these climate goals, we're going to need a lot more electricity.
Yes.
Right? That means we're going to need to build a lot more electrical infrastructure.
Yes.
So things like high voltage transmission lines, substations, distribution wires, all those kind of nerdy
battery
things.
Storage, lots of different things. Yep.
And so a lot of these things are often reviewed and approved by state and local bodies.
Yes.
And sometimes they need approval from several local bodies.
Yes.
And that can create a lot of problems, right? There's a lot of potential for things to get held up or bogged down in local conflict. And as we've seen play out all over the country, a lot of times this infrastructure or unpopular infrastructure in general gets piled up in certain communities, and it's often lower income communities and communities of color. So given that the mantra of the day is electrify everything, how is the Biden administration thinking about the siting process for electrical infrastructure? And how are we going to go about making sure that community voices and tribal governments are part of the decision-making process?
Look, I think that, part of the job of looking at where you're going to be in 2035 and how to get to clean electricity, and then looking at 2050 is not looking already at where we need to be in 2050 and how to get there. It's knowing you have to get there and looking at what you do tomorrow. What you do in the next 10 years and how do you invest, which is why President Biden has a very aggressive and bold, investment strategy. And part of it is to invest significant resources in transmission, because you have to, and to bring that battery storage technology and manufacturing to our country, because we want to grow the jobs, right? And so I would say that that it's a whole lot easier to look at transmission than it is to look at new natural gas pipelines, okay? It is a lot easier to convince people that this is the thing to do and they can live with it if you look at putting it in places that are already available and making sure that you're not looking for a transmission line that's 2,000 miles, but instead looking at where you need it and what's doable today. And so we've already identified 20 improvements in the transmission grid, connections that will open up large swaths of renewable energy into the grid system in places where we can construct them and almost can do it immediately. We've just had an announcement between Secretary Granholm at Energy and Secretary Mayor Pete Buttigieg at Transportation, where they're working together. DOE is actually identifying significant resources right away that can be spent by building transmission lines along existing highway and rail rights of way, where nobody would be bothered by it, and we can immediately make this happen. So we have to get people excited and get them to see the future, not ask them to bite off more than they can chew now. So we think there's lots of opportunities here, and don't take the biggest hurdle first. Get people engaged, acclimated, talking about the value it brings, raising the health profile of these new technologies and how much better and how much more accessible they can make renewable energy to the communities that have been disinvested in all across the United States, that we know has been impacted by systemic racism. Let's give a voice to those communities. Let's invest in community-driven projects. And so there's all of these factors will get people engaged in a way that this won't feel like it's a burden, and will really actually present significant opportunities to put people back to work. EVs are one of the most significant new advances in technology that is going to transform the transportation sector. I'm not just talking about cars, I'm talking about electric buses. We're going to electrify 20% of those yellow school buses. You know why? Because when the other 80% sit there, the mothers are going to get ticked off and yell at Katie and say, we need some more resources. Let's kick it off, right? And this is a chance to show people what the future can look like and what it means. And we have to make sure that workers aren't left behind and there's opportunities for them. But this is really about, how we build a future where we all matter and we all have a voice in that future. And we can shape our own communities in ways that benefit all of us. And I know it might sound a little sappy, but President Biden did not design a climate strategy. He designed an investment strategy that was good for people. And he made sure that climate and clean energy was a part of it, because that's how our economy needs to grow. That's how we get more workers. That's how we clean our air. That's how we transform houses into houses you can live in and afford to live in. That's how we invest in transit. That's how we get broadband access. You know, even in Massachusetts, we have 2.5% of our people who don't have access to really reliable broadband. Can you imagine? I mean, that's like the electricity of today. You know, so there's a long way that we have to go. But I honestly believe that the best way to do this is to just begin. Just show the benefits, get people engaged. And I think the rest will happen. I think innovation will happen, and we'll get some investment there. And you'll see before you know it that we will be able to achieve not just clean energy in 2035, but you'll be seeing a transformation of the vehicles in which we drive. You'll see a transformation in the kind of homes that we're going to construct. And you'll see a way in which we're going to build an energy transmission system that isn't pulling teeth, but is more, how do I get it?
I hear that. And I would say that if you can find a way to make transmission and electrical infrastructure exciting to people, please let me know how you do that, because I try to do that all day, every day. But I want to just park for 1 minute, because you talked about, let's take the example of transmission lines here. Big highways, big right of ways, yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. But how are we going to make sure that communities are involved and that they feel like they have a say in where some of this infrastructure goes? Because these are wires you're going to see, these are substations you're going to see.
Sorry, that's my 2-year-old grandson trying to do FaceTime, because we miss each other when I'm in Washington, and so I apologize for that. Yeah. How are we going to? What was the question? I know I listened to the punchline. Go ahead.
How are we going to make sure that this all gets done in a way that makes communities feel like they're?
I think, well, part of the obligation that President Biden put on the table, that he's made a commitment to, is to make sure that at least 40% of the benefits of all this trillions of dollars of investment go to environmental justice communities, those that have been overburdened by pollution, traditional pollution, overburdened in a way that impacts their ability to be resilient in a pandemic, because you're seeing Black, brown, tribal, indigenous communities and poor communities being hardest hit. They're also the ones in the crosshairs of climate change. So we have to make sure that the focus is on lifting those communities and driving investment there. And so I think it's going to be really important for us not just to invest, but to look at the programs that we're investing in that already exist, in new programs, so that the people in those communities get a say before decisions get made. Isn't that the respect that you want to pay? I think part of the challenge that we've seen is that there's formulaic ways of doing things, like it or not, and we're going to be really good and show you how to run your own community. That cannot be the stature and won't be the stature of this administration. We're now looking at all those programs and saying, okay, how do we build in listening sessions up front? How do we get communities engaged in this? This should not be about forcing things. This should be about opportunities and listening. And really, when you look at issues of environmental justice, a lot of those issues get translated very quickly into opportunities that community sees that we should have an ability to support. And so I do think it's getting away from the formulas. It's getting away and into what we talked about a little earlier is community block grants. Let folks have a say in their own lives, and they will speak pretty clearly and loudly, and we have to listen to that.
Awesome. So my next question is that it is often said that states are the laboratory for federal policy. And I think here in Massachusetts, we've shown that to be true. offshore wind, for example.
Yes.
We were the first ones to open up a bidding process for wind projects. And then once everyone saw that it was feasible and affordable, a bunch of other states jumped on board. So you're from Massachusetts, you know the state and its strengths well. What else would you like to see from the state? What else could we be piloting or trying out that you could then take national?
Well, one of the things that we've been talking about, and I think, I think you're doing, there's no criticism here. It's just, what do you do next? I really think we have to get much more serious about electrification of homes. I really do, because you're getting great at the utilities, getting cleaner and cleaner. But, you have to look at the utilities, and you have to look at the appliances in homes. I think ground source heat pumps are absolutely a part of the future. And I'm looking for an ability to also look at new building standards and how you build the next generation of buildings in a way that they won't need to be retrofit. But part of this is the challenge of supporting this, because we are right now looking at how we go back and work with HUD on affordable housing, how we look at the mortgage structures that the federal government supports, so that you're trying to drive the best technologies and the best building standards into the system if you're going to actually support it through the federal government. And we're looking at, things like our VA system, so that our veterans are actually provided reasonable housing. But it all can be done. But like any other transition, Miriam, it really helps to have federal dollars to ease the original crunch. But with renewables, you get to a certain level and they take off themselves. And so one of the things we're looking at, like our investments in 500 electric vehicle charging stations across the country, we're not going to do it by ourselves, because the private sector is going to be advantaged. I want the private sector bearing some of that cost. And so there has to be partnerships here. And I know that Massachusetts has been aggressive in many ways on all of these issues, but there are always the next thing that can be done. And I think in many ways, building legs behind a little bit, and it would be great to have that done. Let's keep moving towards electrifying our homes. Let's look at those new building codes that we can put in place. Let's look at how we, open up opportunities for more renewable energy. There's just a wealth of things that can be done. And part of the challenge, I think, is also to recognize we do have to get people out of their cars. People need to get around. A lot of communities of color rely heavily on transit. We have to have a transit system that doesn't double the transportation time to get to work. And I live in Jamaica Plain. Don't tell me that we need to have a Jamaica Way that is piled up with traffic like it used to be all day long. We have to do better than that. So there's lots that we can do, including, moving away from diesel trucks in the core of our cities and get them electric. Get the electric buses up and running, because that contributes so heavily to kids' asthma. We have to do better, and there's ways in which we can certainly invest and do more. And I know that Katie and others are exploring those, as is folks in the State House. And so I'm confident that I live in a state that's going to look for those opportunities and invest in them. But I'll do the best I can while I'm in the federal government to make sure that we're partnering on these, because Lord knows over the 4 years of the prior administration, it was all about states and cities. And it's what allowed me to sleep at night, was knowing that while we lost an aggressive posture for 4 years, we didn't lose it all. And so I'm pretty sure they'll continue to show the way.
Great. Well, we have 1 minute left, and I just want to ask you one final question, which is that, as you just said, in the last couple of years, it's been states and local governments that have been the big leaders on climate. But there are people out there who would argue that a lot of what we need A lot of the big changes we need to make would be a lot more efficient if we coordinated at a regional and national level. If you could, in the minute we have left, what are some of the things the Biden administration is doing on this? Is this something you're thinking about?
Oh, it always is, and remember, there's lots of different regions across the country, so it depends on where we are, what we're talking about. Say it again.
Let's say New England.
Let's say New England. Yeah, I mean, I think there are ways in which we can get more aggressive in our regional efforts. I know that Katie's been looking at the Transportation and Climate Initiative. I know that there's a lot of work that we did with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that can be done more. I think standards can be tightened. I think more investment in innovation is always good and would be beneficial. I do think that there needs to be a more sustainable system for looking at how we upgrade our transit systems. And Lord knows, I want some money in Amtrak, so that we're not waiting on every other train to go by before you can get to the next stop. There's so much opportunities that can be done. And frankly, we really have to look carefully at continued investment in natural gas. There's plenty of information and evidence now that says there's lots of leaks in the system. Those leaks are methane. Those leaks can be heavily contaminated with other toxins in your home and elsewhere. And so we just have to think about how to make that shift to electric and do it in a way that will continue to maintain the affordability and reliability of our system. So it's a big ask, but don't tell me it can't be done. The progress we've made already has been remarkable. We just need a lot of women running the system. That's what I'm totally convinced of.
Awesome. Well, I could ask you questions all night, but I know you have some very important work to do for the country and you need to call your grandson back.
I do.
Let you go there. Gina McCarthy serves as the White House National Climate Advisor. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
It was so much fun. Thanks, ma'am.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the second part of our event. And I have just realized that I never introduced myself at the top of this. So hello, everyone. I am Miriam Wasser. I'm an environmental reporter with WBUR. So we have 4 amazing, amazing guests for this panel, and I am so excited to hear what they're going to say. But before I introduce them, I just want to go over what's going to happen. So I'm going to lead about 40 minutes of Q&A, including some super fast, fun lightning round questions. And then we're going to open it up to audience questions. So just a reminder, there should be a link or a website at the bottom of your screen, slido.com. You can go there and enter in the code CLIMATE to ask some questions. So on our panel, we have Secretary Katie Theoharides, who leads the Massachusetts Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And in this role, she oversees the state's 6 environmental, natural resources, and energy agencies. Next, we have Rachel Cleetus. Rachel is the Policy Director with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's an expert in clean energy policy, decarbonization efforts, and much, much more. We're also joined by Elizabeth Turnbull Henry, who leads the Environmental League of Massachusetts. And Elizabeth and ELM have played a huge role in shaping climate policy in the state and in making sure that our transition to the clean energy future is well planned and equitable. And then last, but certainly not least, we are so lucky to have Reverend Mariama White Hammond. Reverend Mariama is the founding pastor of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester and has been an environmental and social justice leader in the state for years. So also not too long after she accepted our invitation to be on tonight's panel, Boston's new acting mayor, Kim Janey, appointed her Chief of Environment, Energy, and Open Space for the city of Boston. So congrats on the new role, and we are so excited to have you here. And let's go to our first lightning round. So when you think about President Biden's agenda, what are you most excited about And what are you most concerned about? What are some of the biggest obstacles to making things happen? So Elizabeth, I'm going to go to you first.
Well, I'm excited. ELM has long believed that if we are visionary and principled and organized, we can make an incredibly bright future. And listen to Advisor McCarthy. I mean, we have a presidential administration that really shares this spirit. I think what I'm concerned about is that I think people increasingly understand the downside of climate change, but in my mind, too few see the upsides of decarbonization. A lot of what you heard about from Gina. Beyond just slowing climate change, the human health, jobs, innovation, the frenzy of economic activity that we could unleash, globally, air pollution is arguably the single largest contributor to premature death. 2018, Harvard estimates we lost 8 million people around the world because of breathing fossil fuel particulates. And so a decarbonized future could be so much brighter in so many ways.
Great. Okay. Reverend Mariama, I'm coming to you next.
Yeah, so I would say the prioritization of economic justice, really important. I think it's going to bring a lot of people in, and the prioritization of environmental justice communities, because some of us have already get the burden again and again and again, and I'm glad that's being named. On the flip side, I get the big broad strokes. I'm waiting to get more of the details because often the devil's in the details. And so I wouldn't say that I'm concerned, but I have seen both here locally and elsewhere the beautiful broad sweeping statements, and some of those get lost when the details come out. So I'm paying close attention for some of those details.
Great. Okay. Secretary Theoharides.
Well, we are thrilled to see science and climate change policy return to the federal government. As Advisor McCarthy mentioned, the states who have been working on this have been working on it without the support of an administration who is pushing this forward. And so this has given us a lot of wind in our sails, as well as confidence that we have a federal partner moving forward who's going to invest in this, who's going to come up with strong federal standards and help pick up many of the pieces that fell by the wayside over the last 4 years. And Elizabeth is right. This is a significant opportunity for communities, for economies, and doing this with an environmental justice focus is so important and is something the administration is clearly embracing. Something I worry about is the continued polarization of climate change as an issue at the federal level, because at some point we will need Congress to act, to pass climate laws, environmental justice laws. And so I hope that the feds can find a way to work on climate change without the polarization of politics.
Great answer. And Rachel.
Yeah, just to echo some themes that have come up, very excited to see science centered, the voices of experts centered, not just in addressing climate change, but think about COVID, think about anything, any issue, and having science centered again is just so important. It's also really refreshing to see a vision that's people-centered. We're talking about equity, justice, jobs, and through it all, what we see is a vision of not just solving climate change as an emissions problem, but really centering the daily needs that people have to put food on their table, jobs, get out of this economic crisis, deal with the crisis of structural racism in our country head on. So that's really gratifying. What keeps me up at night is the worry that there are very strong anti-democratic forces. There are forces that are spreading misinformation, forces that are trying to still keep structural inequities in place. I worry about the role of the fossil fuel industry in our politics and the money and power that they wield. And most of all, I worry about incrementalism. We are in a moment where we need bold, transformative change. This is not a time for nibbling around the edges. So we have to seize this moment.
Great. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about tonight are emission reduction goals. So as we mentioned earlier, the Biden administration during Earth Week set the goal of cutting emissions 50% by 2030. So Elizabeth, I'm going to come to you first. how do Massachusetts emissions reduction goals stack up against this federal goal?
I mean, I think there are a lot of parallels. You know, I would turn to the secretary who can speak sort of to more particulars about how our baseline year differs 1990 to 2005. But we are all headed towards a net zero economy, and I think that's terrific.
Great. So Secretary Theoharides, maybe you can walk us through briefly a little bit about the Massachusetts climate law that was recently signed and what that says about emissions, and then what the Baker administration is putting in place to meet these goals, and kind of follow up, do we need federal assistance to meet those goals?
Absolutely. So thanks to the partnership of folks like Elizabeth and Rachel and others here who have pushed for the climate bill to get through the legislature and then to the governor's desk, and have worked with us on key pieces of that. The law went into effect on March 26th. And what it does is it sets into statute a net zero emissions target for 2050. That the state committed to back in January of last year. And it also sets interim targets. And our interim target for 2030 is a 50%, at least 50% reduction target. It's off of a different baseline year. It's very similar, if not a little bit further than a 50% target at the federal level. So we're right in line with what the feds are doing. And the law and our own planning under the original Global Warming Solutions Act require us to publish a 10-year plan and then to chase the policies and strategies to ensure we can hit that target. And so there's a number of them that I know will come up in discussion, but some of the key pieces of this are around electrification of the building sector. As Gina mentioned, that's a key piece. We haven't made as much progress as we need to there. So energy efficiency and electrification, also transforming our transportation system to be clean and electric, and also to encourage more use of our public transit system and equitable transportation options. And then finally, to keep pushing on the aggressive renewable energy deployment we have here in Massachusetts that's anchored by that offshore wind resource and the potential to build those jobs here in the Commonwealth. But to your other question about whether or not we need help from the feds, yes, we do. And we've been waiting, and we are so excited to have some of those resources available to us. I remember in the early days of 2017, I was copying and pasting websites that I loved from different federal agencies on climate change that were actually being taken down. And so that's maybe a minor detail to some, but the scientific resources and availability of long-term data sets is something that is so key and fundamental to our work on these issues in terms of tracking climate change impacts. More importantly, the investments in renewable resources, whether it's battery storage or clean hydrogen or any of these solutions, a FERC, a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that is interested in stakeholder participation and is also willing to tell our regional grid operators that they need to look at state policy goals and climate goals and incorporate that into their work. And then, just the support of a federal government who wants to chase significant emission reductions as a nation, not on a state-by-state basis, is something that's going to help us all moving forward.
Great, and I think that's a really great point about federal resources being more than just dollars, but also being guidance and scientific knowledge. And people, great people, like many of them from Massachusetts now. We have a surprising number of people in climate positions. So Reverend Mariama, you have told me that you think that we might be putting too much emphasis on reducing the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and maybe not enough emphasis on changing the way that we live in the world. Can you tell us a little bit more about this and how, in your mind, we should really be framing the climate crisis?
Yeah, so when I think about this issue, and it's not a rejection of any other term, but I use the term ecological justice. And that's because ecology, unlike sort of biology and some of the other scientific fields that often tend to break things down to their smallest parts, ecology looks at things in systems and in relationships. And from my perspective, the reason that we're in the position that we're in is that we've built an economy and a society on extraction and exploitation of certain folks and certain resources. And from my perspective, humanity is supposed to be sharing this planet with each other and with all the other species. All the other species are doing what they're supposed to do. There's one bad actor. And I think climate change gives us a deadline to get ourselves together, to stop behaving as we do. None of us knows how to make water. None of us can create oxygen. And yet we are abusive to the species that make it possible for us to live. And we are abusive to each other. So climate change is a result of all of the ways of living that we need to not just save ourselves. We need to stop living that way. And if we don't stop living that way, I'm not sure that we deserve to survive. And so I'm not saying that I don't pay attention. I read the climate news every day. But if we are not willing to change our calculation of who deserves to live and who we believe is expendable, then I'm not sure that our species is enlightened enough that we should continue to be part of the planetary ecosystem. So I think there's so many ways we can do that. And part of that is prioritizing a right relationship with all the other species, right? Appreciating trees for what they give us, having a right relationship with the ocean and not just thinking it's something that we can use to get around. But I think this last year, we've also had a real reckoning around those of us in this country who feel like our lives have been expendable since the very beginning. Indigenous folks who were living in right relationship. If they were in charge, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in right now. My family came here to work land that was stolen, and our labor was stolen. And so I think that for me, not just as a spiritual leader, but as a human, I feel like we need to shift the way we behave with one another, or we don't deserve to survive. And this is an amazing opportunity. I say COVID, over the last year, we all got put on the timeout step. And I hope that on that timeout step, we thought really hard about why some of our communities have been decimated by COVID, why some of us thought it was okay to get at the front of the line in vaccination when other people were struggling. We need to have some of these hard conversations and change direction. So it's not that I ignore parts per million. It's that they are an outgrowth of a very sick system that needs to be changed at a more fundamental level so that we actually become the people in society that I actually believe we want to be. I would love to see all of the communities that have been showing up around racial justice. I want you to start organizing to receive substations in your community. Stop sending them to East Boston, where we all fly in and out. We have the airport there, we have the jet fuel there, we have the salt piles there, we have the oils there, and they've been asked to take another substation. I want to see racial justice mean that Marblehead and Swampscott down the road say, you know what? It's not fair for East Boston and Chelsea to take all of the burden for the environmental harm. We are going to stand up and we're going to take it. That's the kind of shift we need so that we actually can be the kind of species that deserves to survive.
Great. And we are going to talk about electrical infrastructure in a little while, but I quickly want to come to Rachel and ask, just on this topic, are we prioritizing climate mitigation at the expense of resiliency? And what is the correct balance to be striking with those two ideas?
Yeah, this was a very powerful vision that the Reverend just laid out for us. And I think at the heart of it is this understanding that we're not going to get out of the challenge we face right now if we don't reckon with how we got here in the first place. Because we're not going to be able to just techno-adapt our way out of this challenge. We're talking about really transformative change. And when I think about the climate challenge, On the mitigation front, we talk about emissions, but we're also talking about an entire energy system that has had deeply inequitable consequences in terms of emissions, not just heat trapping emissions, but criteria air pollutants, water pollutants, et cetera. Right here in the state of Massachusetts, we know this to be the case, that communities of color are bearing a higher brunt of these pollutants. So as we're transitioning our electricity system to be a lower carbon system, we have to reckon with the fact that we need transformative changes in the very structures and governance of the electricity system, not just the end of pipeline change from coal to wind and solar, but really community access to these resources, a vision for how they can directly benefit from these resources. And one of the biggest wins in this climate bill that Secretary Theoharides mentioned is that environmental justice communities in Massachusetts fought for over a decade to get a definition of environmental justice communities in that bill and an assessment of the cumulative burden of pollution that they face. Because what's happening is right now we regulate this pollution on a source pollutant basis, and we don't take account of the multiple sources and the heavy burden of this cumulative pollution that communities of color and low-income communities are facing. So that's on the mitigation side. On the resilience side, as you mentioned, we don't get to pick here. We have to act in a robust way across both fronts, because unfortunately we have already locked in some very, very profound climate impacts. Here in Massachusetts, sea level rise, of course, along our coastline, which is already causing much more sunny day flooding, the flooding that happens even without storms. We know that as the climate system warms, we're starting to see more extreme temperatures. Even our seasonal patterns are changing here. And the Northeast is warming faster than places closer to the equator. So we actually are going to start to see the kinds of conditions that we're just not used to. And when you think about people, low-income folks who are going to have to pay higher electricity bills in summertime, when you start to think about the fact that most of our aging home infrastructure here isn't built for hot climates. They don't even have air conditioning. We're still building brand new schools in the state of Massachusetts that don't have air conditioning, even though that summer is coming earlier and earlier. So again, the brunt of these inequities of climate impacts too are going to fall harder on those who have fewer resources. When you think about people's homes getting flooded because of sea level rise, think about a working class family. That's their single biggest asset. As it starts to flood, it's going to lose value, and they will lose value and financial stability. So we have to act on both fronts here in Massachusetts. It has to be done in a way that's informed by scientific projections. We can't just today, what the past is just not a good predictor of what the future is going to bring in terms of these worsening impacts. And we're still building on our waterfront. We're still putting expensive property in places that will flood. We're still imagining somehow that we can, again, use technology and hard infrastructure to protect us indefinitely, instead of investing in the kind of natural solutions. And Massachusetts has been actually very forward-thinking in this space. We understand the value of wetlands. We understand the value of preserving our coastline. But again, let's not do it for a few rich elite or our expensive economic waterfront and leave behind communities like East Boston, where ironically the airport is so well fortified and protected right there on the water, but the community around it is still not seeing the benefits of that climate resilience or the solar investments that could have helped instead of the substation that they're trying to locate there. So again, I think we have to act on both fronts, and the projections that we see now around climate change are truly sobering. So we have to get moving fast. And the final piece I would say around the climate goals, what's really important is to have near-term goals. That 2030 goal at the federal level, 50 to 52% below 2005 levels. The Massachusetts bill's 2030 target, that's important. 2050, yes, we need to get there. But what we do in this next consequential decade is going to be critical to keeping climate goals within reach and improving people's lives.
So I just want to follow up really quickly for those listening at home who might not be familiar with the East Boston substation. This has come up a couple of times. This is a proposed project that would be right on Chelsea Creek in East Boston, and it's across the street from a playground and near where a lot of people live, and people have a lot of concerns about its safety and also that it might flood because of sea level rise. So it's a pretty controversial project. But Elizabeth, I want to come to you with a question about environmental justice here, because I know that ELM worked with a lot of other groups to get this strong environmental justice language into the climate law now. Can you tell us a little bit about those years of effort and then the significance of these provisions?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a priority for the environmental justice community, frankly, long before ELM was involved. I think Rachel said at least a decade. I think, Reverend, you may know the origin story of this bill, but it's been a long time coming, and I'm thrilled that it was passed. And frankly, Secretary, I'm thrilled that the administration sought to even further strengthen it in the amendment process. We have a terrific bill now. It's long overdue, and establishes a new definition for environmental justice, and requires a more extensive stakeholdering, and the cumulative impacts discussion that we had earlier. So it really is important. That said, Massachusetts loves to congratulate itself, right? We were joking about this earlier before the call. We think of ourselves as number one. We love to talk about how we're number one, and I think this bill is good, but it is not. We should not believe for a moment that this means that we have attained any sort of fundamental environmental justice here in the Commonwealth. I mean, I think that we have a lot of work left to do. One of the priorities this coming session is to take a look at the Energy Facilities Siting Board. Advisor McCarthy talked about how we were going to need a lot more substations and wires, and that's true. By 2050, we expect that we'll need to double the size of our electric grid to accommodate the electrification of transportation and buildings. And on one hand, that's exciting, right? This means that we're going to be turning off fossil fuel plants across New England, and these kinds of assets, substations, transmission lines have a lesser environmental impact, but they are not without social and ecological impacts. And we need a transparent and inclusive process for siting the literally hundreds of new substations that we will need across New England, the thousands of miles of transmission. And so ELM and many of our allies are taking a look at Energy Facilities Siting Board reform and looking at more inclusive processes, having that body, which is ultimately responsible for placing so much of this stuff, making sure that it has a membership that is representative of the interests of all of the stakeholders, and has our long-term decarbonization and social justice goals in its mandate. So really excited for the win that we had with the environmental justice bill, and excited to continue the push.
Great. And Secretary Theoharides, you are also the chairwoman of the Energy Facility Siting Board, which is the state body, for those listening at home, that is in charge of permitting different sorts of energy projects. And you and I have talked extensively about this climate law and the different initiatives that the Baker administration is undertaking to fundamentally change how you go about citing projects or deciding what an environmental burden is. And I wonder if you can talk us through some of those.
Yeah, so a key piece of this all is changing the process to better reflect input of all communities, but particularly environmental justice communities and communities that have been overburdened by whether it's air pollution, water pollution, heavy burdens of infrastructure, to make sure that's actually taken into account in processes like the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, our Department of Environmental Protection's different permitting processes, as well, and also the Energy Facilities Siting Board. And so, one of the major things in the climate legislation that got passed, and Rachel and Elizabeth both mentioned this, is the idea of looking at cumulative impact when you're permitting any large-scale project. So historically, the agencies around the country have taken a case-by-case look at a project. What are going to be the new impacts of this particular project in a community? This change in the legislation will allow our Department of Environmental Protection to develop a process to look at the entire burden of pollution already on a community, already facing a community, which will be a fundamental shift in the process that informs the decision-making about granting permits. So that's a big piece. And that's not just, we're going to start with air, because air is one of the most significant from a public health perspective, but you can look at the cumulative impacts in many different ways, whether it's water or waste, or just the presence of infrastructure and the burden of infrastructure in a community. So that's number one. I think the other thing, into Elizabeth's note, is that our Department of Public Utilities and our Energy Facilities Siting Board have recently opened up orders to look at their process for inclusion in decision making. It's not just language access or timing meetings right. It's also the fact that energy policy is difficult to access, period. And so how can we ensure that all communities around the state are able to access the decision-making process, enter in early into the process, so that decisions are being made with community engagement right from the start, and provide resources to support community organizations who want to be part of the process. So often you see entities that deal with permitting and siting typically have the resources to come in with the support they need, the technical analysis they need, the capacity to understand the decisions that are being made and to argue their side. I think that's harder from a community who is arguing against a project. And so we're looking at ways to make sure that everyone has resources to access the decision and to be part of that process. Just a few things that are beginning, but I think the work under this DPU and EFSB order will be really game changing in how we go forward on process going into the future.
Great, and one thing I just want to mention is something that you and I talked about as well, which is that New Jersey is undertaking some similar processes, but there's no real national template for how to do this, and Massachusetts really has an opportunity here to set a standard that others could follow. Really quick, because I want to make sure we get to audience questions. Let's get to our next lightning round here. Let's switch it up a bit. So we're going to assume that we have billions of dollars coming to the state from the federal government if the Biden administration's climate agenda goes through, if the infrastructure plan goes through. If you had a magic wand and the decision about how to spend this money were up to you, what are one or two things you would prioritize? And Reverend Mariama, I'm going to come to you first.
Yeah, so I think one of the things would be retrofits on homes and buildings. And I think we have done a good job on some of the big buildings. We still need to do more. But I also think if we did more retrofits in people's homes, it would bring it home to people, literally, right? And I think that building, to really address this, we need to build a movement of people. And so it has to sort of touch people's lives in real, tangible ways. And so I think emphasizing retrofits where people can see climate adaptation in their own home would be one of the powerful ways. I think there's a lot of ways to intervene, but that's one really important and powerful way, I think, to bring lots of everyday citizens into it. And I would add with that solar and batteries and how we're helping more of them to get off the grid. Again, making it very real and tangible right in front of folks.
Great. Rachel?
Yeah, I think I would suggest that we invest in affordable, accessible public transit. We know that transportation here in Massachusetts, just like in the US, is the largest source of heat trapping emissions now. There's been a lot of talk about electric vehicles and charging, and we need that, but that's still a one person, one car type of model. And we need to have a much more transformative vision of our current system. We need to be thinking about buses, we need to be thinking about rail, and public transit desperately needs a shot on the arm right now. And we have to do it in a way that community stakeholders are engaged so that we understand what the needs are, what the gaps are, and really help meet them, not just in dense urban areas, but also out in the suburbs where, frankly, people can't afford to live in a lot of dense urban areas now and are having to move further and further out because of the incredible cost of living. So yeah, the transportation sector is a big equity challenge here in Massachusetts.
Great. Elizabeth?
Offshore wind infrastructure. I mean, by 2050, 1 in every 2 electrons are projected to come from wind that is hopefully responsibly built and harvested off of our shores. So I want to see ports, transmission, planning, design, and installation, that grid, landside grid updates, workforce development, and job training to set us up for this industry for decades to come.
Awesome. And Secretary Theoharides?
Well, I would agree with all 3 of those, unsurprisingly. I mean, buildings are huge. The offshore wind, we've been lucky that we have a port that's ready to go. We're one of, the only state that has a port that's ready to go with the weight requirements, but we need to do that on a large scale everywhere. And transportation is obviously something that is game changing and needs significant funding. I just wanted to underscore the education component on all of this. And I think that the Biden administration has talked a lot about this because it's not just our young people, but it's also folks who are in our current fossil fuel economy and finding ways for them to transition into this new clean energy economy. So I think job training has to underscore all of this at our vocational schools, at our colleges and universities, but also for professionals in the field now. How can we get more people into this emerging field?
Awesome. So we have somehow barely scratched the surface of the long list of questions I had for all of you, but I just saw what time it is and we should move to answer audience questions. So this first one is about offshore wind, and this is something we just mentioned. This person asks, I think Massachusetts is missing the boat on all those, and all those jobs are going to New Jersey. Why is the state behind, or is the state behind, and how do we get in front? So Secretary Theoharides, I'm actually going to come to you first on this one.
So we are, incredibly lucky in Massachusetts that offshore wind has been a priority before I think it was even really feasible to do. And so we've been working to bring it here because of the capacity we have right off our shores and because of the resources we have and the investments we've made in our New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. Since that terminal was built, we have seen developers locate their headquarters in Bedford and the South Coast and Boston, and we've come to significant agreements with both Vineyard Wind, our first project, first in the nation, and the Mayflower Wind to utilize the terminal as a staging ground and deployment port for their infrastructure. We're also lucky in Massachusetts to have the largest wind blade testing facility in North America right here in Charlestown. And the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center has been working with our Department of Energy Resources and across our administration to really set the stage for the opportunities to come, including the local supply chain angle. And there is much more to do as we build out this industry. New Jersey and New York do have a larger electricity demand, energy demand. And so if you look at the percentage of our power generation that we've procured now in offshore wind, we've actually signed up for contracts representing 12% of our load, which puts us ahead of New York, who has signed up for about 10% of their load. Each of the states works on different structures of economic development packages. And after the experience with Cape Wind, as we went into this, an important part of getting offshore wind and proving it out, not only for Massachusetts, but frankly for the nation, was to focus on making sure this new industry could be cost effective for Massachusetts ratepayers, where we have some of the higher rates for electricity in the nation, and it does have an impact on low income ratepayers as well as on the development of businesses here, including the supply chain that would ultimately supply offshore wind. So we have worked to keep prices as low as possible while continuing to ramp up the scoring for things like economic development and jobs in our procurements. And so as we're pushing on price and keeping price down, we're looking for opportunities both within the contract to make developers compete for a low cost, but also a low cost with those economic development opportunities, but also looking for other ways outside of the contract. So in a not ratepayer funded way to spur economic development in this industry, and to really make this a Massachusetts-based workforce. And one of the things we've done in our latest RFP that is slated to come out soon is look not just at the jobs we're going to create, but make sure we're creating an inclusive, diverse workforce that is representative of Massachusetts.
Great. Does anyone else Elizabeth, want to weigh in on that?
Sure, and we applaud the decision by the administration to adopt minority economic participation and more economic inclusion criteria in that RFP. Thank you for doing that. From my point of view, I think that Massachusetts is doing some terrific things on offshore wind, and I have real admiration and respect for your team at EEA and the Mass Clean Energy Center. But I think at this point in our offshore wind industry development, I have to say, I often wonder if we aren't handicapping ourselves with a pretty relentless focus on delivering offshore wind at the lowest possible cost. For those listening, we have a legal requirement that each procurement is less expensive than the one that came before it, this price cap clause, and 70% of the evaluation criteria in the request for proposals that the state puts out is focused on price. And so any rational developer.
Quickly explain what that means when the state, says we're looking for a contract for 800 megawatts of wind. What's happening?
So I'm sorry. So
just explain what you mean by that. Maybe the RFP process and the 70% weight given.
Yeah. So when the state is directing the utilities to purchase a chunk of offshore wind, a contract, in this case for the delivery of 20 years worth of power. And the state has a lot of great priorities and parameters that they're looking for projects that mitigate impacts to ecosystems, that protect the critically endangered great whale, that allow for the coexistence of fishing and the many other ocean uses that we value, that have sensible interconnection. I mean, there's a whole lot that we're asking from the development community. And unfortunately, all of that qualitative stuff goes into is only worth 30% of the points, and so the other 70% is on price. And developers are, I think, rational actors and are really focusing on price. And I wonder if that is at the expense of some of the other things that, in the long term, Massachusetts might really value: more infrastructure development, local manufacturing, workforce development, and so on. And when I think of the fact that New England has only procured about 10% of the offshore wind, the 6 New England states procured about 10% of the offshore wind that we'll need by 2050, more or less. There really is a long-term need for workforce development and infrastructure. So,
maybe
go ahead, Rachel.
Just to jump in briefly, we have some really ambitious, wonderful goals now, both from the Biden administration and from the state of Massachusetts. The most recent climate bill in Massachusetts raises the offshore wind target up to 5,600 megawatts. We now have the Biden administration out there with a 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal. Absolutely, we have to get the details right, everything from permitting to innovation to jobs. But there's a huge opportunity here. And when we look out in the world and look at what Scandinavian countries have done, for example, we have to look at those models and reach for that vision. There is a real moment here of opportunity, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's not Massachusetts versus New Jersey and New York. The pie is big enough and it's growing, given our climate goals. What we can't do is set expectations low and get stuck in the process and all of these hurdles. We really have to find a way to get through making sure that we've got better permitting processes, that we have the innovation, that the jobs piece is getting done right here. But I guess I'm going to say I'm a glass half full kind of person. I'm seeing a tremendous opportunity here, and really Massachusetts can be at the forefront of this offshore wind revolution.
So I'm going to jump to the next question, which someone writes, I'm worried that the federal money will end up in the hands of rich people. How do we make sure it lands in Chelsea and Dorchester and in the hands and communities of people who need it? So Reverend Mariama Hammond, this feels like a great question for you.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that one of the reasons I'm really thankful that the Biden administration has been really explicit about environmental justice communities being at the front of the line. Because the reality is we've already gotten plenty of the burdens. So now, if we want to make it more even, we need to get plenty of the benefits. And so some of that is in there. I think, you know, in the past in Massachusetts, one of the big challenges, and I get it. I mean, I think it's the governor, when you're trying to get everyone to the table, it's easiest to do that if there's something in it for everyone, right? But then sometimes what that means is you're not forwarding or being honest about the fact some people have gotten a lot for a long time and others have not. And so I'm again, this is one of the places where I want to see the details, because the stated priorities in the Biden plan, and I participated in some conversations about this at the national level, is really putting environmental justice, frontline Indigenous communities at the front of the line for benefits. And if that happens, that is game changing, because that's not how it's been done. Quite frankly, that's not how we've been doing it in Massachusetts. The legislature breaks my heart every year in July, because we go for this hard press to get things across the finish line. And almost always the equity provisions get cut out at the end. And, you know, I'm on my desk with a glass of wine, really angry. And I have a few months before they're going to meet again to like work through my, you know, pain. I am thankful that the way the most recent bill went and the level of focus on environmental justice. And I was really thankful. Lots of people who EJ is not their first priority in the work. I felt like we're much more consistent and much more supportive than I've seen in the past. So I want to believe that we are taking a turn, that we're shifting, that we're moving in a new direction. We still have some legacies. The substation is one of them, but I want to also celebrate. In Springfield, recently, there was a ridiculously dirty plant that was being proposed, and we're calling it biofuel. That's a whole nother thing. We'll talk about that some other point, what really qualifies as clean. But finally, Springfield, which is one of the asthma capitals of the country, the decision was made, no, we're not going to put another burning plant there. So again, we've got to keep making sure that this progress continues, but I do see hopeful signs. And we just got to keep paying attention to those details.
Great. And I'm going to ask another question from the audience that feels related, which is, what can be done for environmental justice communities who are currently suffering overburden status and for whom cumulative emissions were ignored? And this person cites the East Boston substation or the Weymouth natural gas compressor station. And Rachel, I'm going to come to you first on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, the reality is that we're not even enforcing the current regulations that are in place. In a lot of parts of the country, including here in Massachusetts, there are places that are continuously out of compliance, that are not being, where the existing laws are not being enforced. And then to add to that, this cumulative burden piece, which our current laws don't deal with very well. And Massachusetts is going to take an important step forward here. But connecting the dots to this Justice 40 initiative, which the Biden administration has committed to, where they say that 40% of the benefits of new investments will go directly to communities. And it's key that they're saying benefits, not just dollars, because sometimes when you say dollars, they get co-opted by people from outside who are not really from community. But what I find most heartening at the federal level is that it's not just that we have an administration that's announcing this from on high. The people in the administration now look like community. This is we have environmental justice leaders like Dr. Cecilia Martinez, like Brenda Mallory right there in CEQ. We have Michael Reagan at EPA. We have this White House Environmental Justice Council that's been set up and has been having public hearings. That's what's going to keep us accountable as a nation to these commitments that are being made. So the follow through is super important. Here, for communities that are experiencing those cumulative impacts right now, the first piece is it has to stop, but stop is not enough. We actually have to really give redress to these communities. So deal with the legacy pollution, clean it up, actually make these communities better off in this current system than they are right now. And community has really, there is vision there is solutions there's a very future-oriented frame. People want their children to grow up in cleaner environments. They want the economic opportunities, all of those things. So it's about bringing that energy into the policy spaces. We don't have to invent this from scratch. People have great ideas. We just need to bring them and empower them in the mix. And the final piece, I would just say the vision that's different just now around this infrastructure plan, for example, that Biden has announced, is I don't hear the term shovel-ready projects, because shovel-ready goes to communities that are first in line already. They already have the paperwork done. They've already hired the surveyors, done the permits. Now we have a sustained investment plan. The idea is for the long term, not money in and out like we've done with previous recovery packages after the last crisis, where the money had to be spent very quickly and it went to people who were already well positioned to use it and left a lot of communities behind. We need to have a sustained effort, and that's the difference that I'm seeing right away with this new announcement from the administration.
Great. And you and I spoke the other day, you had a great line where you talked about the Biden's climate agenda being trickle up policy as opposed to trickle down. And I think that feels very relevant. Secretary Theoharides, I want to give you a second to weigh in on what the state can do to remedy environmental injustices that have occurred already.
So I think the investment piece is really critical, and that's come up a number of times in many of the programs that we're now doing at a state level, whether it's our municipal vulnerability preparedness program or our Greening the Gateway Cities program, or other forms of funding and assistance and planning. We're really putting a focus on ensuring that the benefits are flowing to communities that have faced historic burdens in pollution of many different kinds. We are also looking at ensuring that we have good monitoring in communities, such as the air monitoring is a big piece of this, so that we know that as we're deploying new systems, for example, the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is supposed to clean up our transportation system, that the air quality benefits are flowing to the communities that have had the worst impacts from this legacy of particulate matter in communities with heavy levels of congestion. Really looking to make sure that funding that comes in from new climate initiatives like the Transportation and Climate Initiative is being directed to undo some of those injustices. And that takes many shapes and many forms, but one of the key pieces of that effort is having an equity advisory body to direct the state and advise the state on how to best spend those funds, so that it's not the state making the decision around where those should go or what the right solution is. I think that's one of the key pieces here too, is this, the state is not going to say, Chelsea, this is what you want from your benefit package. This is something that we should be hearing from communities on, and the solution might be electric buses, it might be more walkable, safe sidewalks, it might be trees. But we're not saying we have all of the answers to that. So I think there is significant opportunity for some of the investments to be directed to the right communities.
Great, and we have 1 minute left. So Reverend Miriam, I want to come to you on this too. What can be done to redress some of the past environmental injustices? Really quick.
Yeah, so I think, again, everything that's been mentioned is exciting. As we're sort of shutting down those old plants. One of the temptations is to just put the new plants there, and that would not necessarily be just. So I think we need to begin the conversation in our high income neighborhoods that have usually benefited from putting these aside. Let's start the conversation of what it would look like to site across. And we all got to work on our NIMBYism. It is a human trait that we've got to really tackle, because we'll all be on a little dinghy together in the ocean if we don't start shifting and dealing with some of the things that we've struggled with.
I think that is a fantastic note to end on, and I hope we don't all end up on a dinghy together.
It'd be nice. It'd be a fun dinghy.
So somehow it is already 7:15 and we are out of time. I have no idea how that happened, but I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been an amazing conversation, and thank you all in the audience for coming to this. One final note, some super exciting news from BUR. We are launching our first environmental newsletter later this year. So you can get more information about this newsletter as soon as it's available. When you can scan a QR code that should show up on your screen. There we go. Any moment, and it's going to take you to our sign up page where you can enter your email. If you don't know how to use a QR code, there are instructions in the chat for how to do this. And I hope you'll sign up, because we are really, really deep in the process of designing what this is going to look like. And I think it's really going to be worth the read. So with that, again, thank you all for coming, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.